They offered him $15 billion, not in secret, not with subtlety, but boldly, like a man handing over a leash and asking you to chain yourself. The voice on the line belonged to a former president of the United States, Donald Trump himself. The deal? American companies would pour $15 billion into Burkina Faso. Oil refineries, gold mining projects, promises of prosperity. But with one unspoken condition, they would control it all. And to that offer, Captain Ibrahim Traoré answered with a word that roared louder than 1,000 speeches. No. He said no, not just for himself, but for every African elder whose land was stolen, every child who's gone hungry while gold sailed overseas, every worker who labors while others feast. That one word shook the ground. But was it only a refusal or the start of something bigger? Do not blink. This is not just about oil. This is about dignity. Subscribe and walk with us, because the next chapter of Africa will be written in our own ink. It began with a phone call. Not a call from a neighboring president, not from a regional partner, but from the very heart of the empire that has long stared at Africa as quarry, not kin. On that day, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the transitional leader of Burkina Faso, took a call from former U.S. President Donald Trump. The message was wrapped in diplomacy, cloaked in business language, but its core was crystal clear. "We have American companies ready," said Trump. $15 billion. Oil refineries, extraction ventures, gold mining, jobs, infrastructure, opportunity. And then came the clause that carried the weight of centuries. But we must lead. We must control. We must own $15 billion, a number meant to make a poor nation flinch, a figure designed to conjure up new highways, hospitals, pipelines, and progress. And yet, without hesitation, without consultation, without a glance toward compromise, Traoré replied with one word: no. It was not a rhetorical no, not a performative no, but a sacrificial one. Because when a man refuses $15 billion in a nation where many live on a few dollars a day, where roads remain unpaved, and where oil and gold lie untapped beneath weary feet, he is either mad or a man of principle. And Traoré was not mad. He understood the cost. But he understood the history even better. That figure, $15 billion, was never real. It was a trap, a polished collar for a sovereign nation, a promise of investment paired with the quiet theft of autonomy. The West knows this dance well. First they bring the check, then the contract, then the conditions, then the clause. And in the end, your gold is gone. Your oil is gone. Your people are working, but not for themselves. It is the same story Africa has lived for generations. From cotton to cocoa, uranium to cobalt, foreign powers have mastered the art of offering aid in one hand and stealing with the other. Burkina Faso, like many of its neighbors, bears the scars. Decades of underdevelopment are not due to laziness or ignorance, but due to intentional economic strangulation. Deals signed in foreign languages with foreign banks for foreign benefit. And so, when Traoré stood before his people and declared his refusal, he wasn't just rejecting a deal. He was rejecting a pattern. He was saying never again. He spoke plainly. Our gold will not shine in their markets before it builds our schools. Our oil will not light their cities while our children remain in darkness. Burkina Faso is not for sale. To the outside world, it sounded defiant, dangerous. But to his people, it sounded like deliverance. He reminded them of how Africa became poor, not for lack of brains or brawn, but because those who came before him, those who wore fine suits and kissed foreign hands, had opened the gates wide, letting Western companies mine, drill, extract, export, while the people remained barefoot. While children studied in classrooms without roofs, while women gave birth without clinics, while roads crumbled and politicians toasted in Paris, $15 billion? That was bait on a hook. And the hook was ownership without sovereignty. Traoré saw it for what it was. And so he said no. And with that no, he did more than reject a contract. He declared a philosophy. Burkina Faso would walk a new path. Not the easy one of foreign money and silent chains, but the hard one of self-reliance, self-sacrifice, and internal dignity. Its oil would be refined at home. Its gold would serve its own people. Its engineers, its youth, its workers, would build its future with Burkinabe hands, not with foreign tools controlled by foreign wills. This was not economic isolation. This was economic self-respect. And as Traoré closed that call, the world may have chuckled. But Africa listened. Because for once, a leader did not beg. He did not trade dignity for development. He stood his ground and made the earth beneath him shake. But was this just about one phone call or the ghost of 100 years of theft? It was more than just a refusal. It was a rupture. A moment when one word, no, cut through decades of diplomatic illusion and reawakened a people's sense of self. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré rejected the $15 billion offer from Donald Trump and American corporations, it didn't just echo across conference tables in Washington. It rolled like thunder through the villages of Burkina Faso, across the dusty markets of Ouagadougou, into the hearts of farmers, teachers, and young men who'd been told their future lay in exile. He did not reject the offer in secret. He made it public. He told the people, "I said no, not because we don't need development, but because we refuse enslavement." And suddenly something changed. The man they had known as a military captain became more than a leader. He became a symbol, a defender not just of land but of legacy, a man willing to choose poverty over puppetry, hardship over humiliation, resistance over reward, and the people responded. Across Burkina Faso, citizens began to speak differently, not as victims of foreign theft, but as custodians of national treasure. For the first time in years, ordinary men and women began asking, what if we really could do it ourselves? The response was not passive applause, it was participation. Local cooperatives began rallying to support government projects. University students in Ouagadougou volunteered to translate technical documents to support engineers. Women's associations offered their networks to help promote community ownership in upcoming refinery plans. Farmers pledged a portion of their crops to help feed volunteer builders. Because this time, it wasn't just another speech. It was their future being reclaimed. But far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso, the echo of that no struck nerves in high places. Western media outlets began branding Traoré with loaded terms: populist, militarist, strongman. Think tanks questioned his motives. Diplomats muttered about instability. Anonymous officials warned of a new wave of resource nationalism. And then came the whispers. Only weeks after the public refusal, rumors swirled of an Ibrahim Traoré assassination attempt. Though the full details remain unconfirmed, the timing was impossible to ignore. A young leader defies global capital, and suddenly his life is threatened. To many Africans, it felt all too familiar. The ghosts of Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, and Muammar Gaddafi loomed large. Each one had dared to say Africa first and paid with their blood. But Traoré was undeterred. He took to the airwaves and doubled down. "If defending our resources makes me a dictator in their eyes," he declared, "then let the whole world know. I would rather be called a dictator by the West than remembered as a traitor by my people." And with that line, the emotional peak was reached. It wasn't just about oil, or gold, or dollars. It was about dignity, about whether a nation and a continent would forever kneel for its survival or finally stand for its future. The young, the old, the skeptical, the silent, something broke inside them. Something ancient, buried under treaties and debts and polite colonialism. And what rose in its place was a cry not of violence but of vision. A vision that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Across Africa, other leaders took note. Quietly at first, a statement here, a gesture there. But it was clear, the winds were changing. From Mali to Niger, from Guinea to Chad, governments newly freed from Western military compacts began exploring indigenous control of mining rights. Academics began publishing openly on post-neo-colonial resource models. Even in the African diaspora, young activists hailed Traoré as a modern Sankara, the one who said no and lived to build. And yet the question lingered. Could one man's defiance against $15 billion truly change the fate of a nation? Or was it just a moment of pride before the machinery of global capital crushed another dream? But what did the West fear the most, the man or the message? A single refusal, 15 billion turned away with a word, might seem like just another fiery headline in Africa's long, turbulent story. But in Burkina Faso, it became something more. It became a cultural shift. For decades, ordinary citizens had lived with a quiet assumption. Development comes from abroad. Whether it was through loans, aid, or foreign companies, the idea that progress must be imported had soaked into public consciousness like dust in the earth. Schools waited for Western NGOs. Hospitals waited for donations. Workers waited for foreign investors. And governments, often too timid to break free, kept waiting too. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré's uncompromising no cracked that illusion. Suddenly, self-reliance wasn't just a political talking point. It was a national posture. And you could feel it in the streets. Engineers who had long been underpaid or overlooked found themselves recruited into state-led projects. Oil technicians began teaching apprentices how to service local rigs and refineries. Civil service offices began circulating new procurement protocols prioritizing Burkinabe firms for infrastructure contracts. It wasn't just policy, it was psychological transformation. A nation long told it was too poor, too unstable, too developing to manage its own resources, began to believe otherwise. That belief, intangible but powerful, was perhaps the most important result of all. And it was spreading. In rural provinces, village councils began mobilizing to identify land for agricultural cooperatives. Local banks quietly reported increased demand for small business loans, particularly from young entrepreneurs launching tools, services, and resource-adjacent startups. High school curricula were updated in some areas to include practical modules on resource management and civic accountability. Even religious leaders began referencing the oil and gold speech in sermons, framing it not just as political defiance, but as a return to spiritual dignity. Meanwhile, the political winds shifted. When Traoré seized power in 2022, following the Ibrahim Traoré coup, many both inside and outside Burkina Faso questioned his legitimacy. Another uniformed man, another military ruler, another chapter in the cycle of coups. But legitimacy is a strange thing. It doesn't always come from the ballot box. Sometimes it comes from a promise made and kept. By 2024, informal surveys across urban centers showed a sharp rise in public approval for the administration, not because salaries had doubled, not because foreign reserves had soared, but because for the first time in years, people felt respected by their own state. Traoré wasn't just defending borders. He was defending dignity. He wasn't on television talking about global diplomacy. He was in work sites walking with engineers, in factories inspecting local equipment, in schools challenging students to dream beyond aid. And those images, broadcast across local networks, shared on dusty radios passed from mother to daughter, mattered. They showed a leadership present, not distant. Accountable, not invisible. Still, not everyone applauded. Opposition figures warned of economic retaliation. They cited stalled infrastructure deals, delayed shipments, and the growing list of countries wary of working with unpredictable Burkina Faso. International lenders began reassessing terms. Analysts speculated about capital flight. But inside the country, something else took root: ownership. Young people began to speak of staying, not fleeing. Rural families began investing in land improvements. University students formed independent policy clubs focused on post-extractive economies. And in diaspora communities, a new pride emerged. He said no, many would say, and maybe we can say no too. And so the question spreads: if dignity can grow in one country, can it flourish across a continent? If you believe this is how Africa finally breaks the cycle, say new era in the comments below. Because for all the noise about billions lost, there was one thing gained. A nation finally stood upright. But was the cost of this dignity too high, or finally just right? While the dust of dignity rose across Burkina Faso, boardrooms in the West began to shift uncomfortably. The United States, still grappling with the global perception of its waning moral authority, was caught off guard. A sitting African head of state had just turned down $15 billion from American corporations, and did so publicly, defiantly, unapologetically. The Ibrahim Traoré coup had already strained relations between Burkina Faso and Western allies. But this was different. This wasn't a military movement. This was a philosophical revolution, and Washington noticed. State Department memos, according to insiders, began circulating language about strategic recalibration. Diplomatic cables hinted at a rising wave of resource nationalism that might undermine American access to critical minerals. Intelligence briefings warned of growing ties between Burkina Faso and non-Western blocs. Then came the real tremor. News broke of an Ibrahim Traoré assassination attempt. Though unconfirmed in Western media, it exploded across African outlets and local sources. Whether orchestrated externally or from within, the symbolism was too sharp to ignore. A leader rejects imperial terms, and his life is suddenly under threat. In Africa, it felt like déjà vu. Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, even Gaddafi, all names linked by one thing. They dared to say no to the global north and were silenced. Some threw bullets, others threw disinformation, sanctions, and engineered chaos. This time, the people were watching closely. Across the global south, from Latin America to Southeast Asia, commentators drew parallels between Traoré's stand and past struggles for economic sovereignty. Editorials in Brazil and India praised the move. Regional leaders in Mali, Guinea, and Niger held quiet meetings about resource autonomy. Even Russia and China expressed public support, though not without their own interests at heart. But the West, the response was colder. No statements of admiration for national pride. No acknowledgement of the logic behind the refusal. Only warnings of instability, labels of strongman, concern about governance, and still no self-reflection. No apology for the past century of extraction. No reckoning for the billions in wealth pulled from African soil, dressed as investment and returned as dependence. Because to admit that would be to admit the truth, that what Traoré rejected was never just a deal. It was the entire model, and if Burkina Faso could reject it, what if others followed? And when the world listens to Africa, will it hear submission or sovereignty? What comes after a no that shakes the world? For Burkina Faso, it is not silence. It is not retreat. It is the sound of shovels in soil, of engineers drawing plans, of workers raising walls not for foreign flags, but for their own families. The road ahead is steep. Captain Ibrahim Traoré never promised it would be easy. Turning away 15 billion means turning toward sacrifice. It means delays, difficulties, and learning curves. It means building with bare hands what others outsource. But that's the price of dignity. And Burkina Faso has chosen to pay it in full. Already, groundwork has begun. State-led initiatives are mapping domestic oil fields. Local gold cooperatives are forming syndicates to keep extraction profits inside national borders. Educational ministries are reforming curricula to include engineering, civic economics, and industrial planning. This is not about short-term gains. It is about generational resilience. Because if a nation learns to build its own refineries, mine its own minerals, and feed its own people, then it will never again kneel for a loan. Never again beg for crumbs from a feast set with its own gold. And the vision does not stop at Burkina Faso. From Bamako to Conakry, leaders are watching. So are the people. The question is no longer, can we break free? It is, who will join us in doing so? But with vision comes risk. The West has many tools: sanctions, misinformation, destabilization. The Ibrahim Traoré assassination attempt reminded everyone that boldness invites backlash. That standing tall makes you a target. That sovereignty has enemies. Still, the answer is clear. Burkina Faso will not be ruled by fear. Not by markets, not by media, not by missiles. The new African generation, raised in the shadow of betrayal, is rising into the sunlight of pride. They no longer want partnerships of pity. They want partnerships of equals. And so the future has a name. It is Burkina Faso. It has a direction: forward. It has a cost: sacrifice. And it has a motto: we build for us or we are built over. But when the dust settles, will Africa finally own its future? They came with $15 billion. They came with contracts, with smiles, with promises of progress. But beneath the numbers lay an old story, an ancient lie wrapped in new paper. You are nothing without us. And this time, Burkina Faso replied, no. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young soldier shaped not in embassies but in the trenches of truth, stood tall and spoke louder than fear. No, not to dollars, but to domination. No, not to partnership, but to possession. And in that one word, the course of a continent tilted. This was never just about oil or gold. This was about the right to say no, the courage to say yes, to ourselves. It was about rejecting the myth that Africa must be fed to survive, about destroying the illusion that dignity is too expensive, about saying we have enough, not because of what lies beneath our soil, but because of who stands upon it. The Ibrahim Traoré coup may have begun with uncertainty, but it found clarity in conviction. And even when the world responded with the Ibrahim Traoré assassination attempt, the message did not bend. It burned brighter. Because now the stakes are clear. Either we mine our own wealth, or we remain buried by someone else's. Either we refine our own oil, or we become fuel for foreign empires. Either we trust in our hands, or we live on our knees. This is not just the story of Burkina Faso. This is the blueprint for a new Africa. If this story touched your spirit, do not just scroll. Like, comment, and rise. Subscribe, because our history was silenced, but our future must be sung. So tell us, will Africa kneel again? Or has the season of standing begun? Say it loud in the comments, New Africa. Not for sale. We rise together.